As for EBRD, Georgi, it turns out that this Georgia-friendly international financial institution responded to the coronavirus pandemic in Georgia with record investment in 2020. 16 projects worth a total of 630 million euros were signed, helping to address the urgent needs of the country's economy. The 2020 volume was double the bank's activities in the previous year. We can say that the biggest portion of this assistance went on promoting economic resilience by supporting the development of local currency and capital markets. Together with the National Bank of Georgia, it worked to increase the availability of Georgian lari to private companies by setting up a US 200 million foreign exchange swap facility, enabling the EBRD to secure reliable access to liquidity in local currency and continue lending to firms in lari. This is just the biggest portion of this assistance. Assistance goes further, of course.
I remember the governor noting cooperation with EBRD in your interview with him in Georgian for Forbes Talks, which we aired just yesterday late night. It was on Saturday.
Yes, Georgi, you remember it totally right. Gwipოვნეთ also sat down for the checkpoints for a much shorter interview for our viewers on this platform, and we can now listen to why Georgia's central bank decided to take its own path in two main directions: regulating the banking sector amidst pandemic and his stance on monetary policy approach.
Short interview with Governor Gwipოვნeth. No.
So, Governor, thank you for being with us and taking our questions. Let us start with the summing up of 2020.
Elena, thank you for your interest, and I want to wish you and the BMG Group healthy and prosperous
thank you. Same from
2021. Thank you. If we want to characterize 2020, we have to start with pandemic, because in spite of the fact that impact on economies, global economy, which was brought by pandemic, was similar to other crises, global crisis before, nature of pandemic was different, because in the situation it was difficult to foresee when the crisis, pandemic would be over. Of course, once vaccine is available now, it's we are better equipped to see that at some point pandemic will be over, but it gives us surprises at different times, at different stages. For the economy, Georgian economy, of course, as well as for global economy, it was a very negative year. The global economy is going to be to register negative growth. In case of Georgia, growth will be close to, the final results are not known yet, something like between 5.5% and 6%. It brought some challenges for inflation in Georgia as well, mainly because of depreciation of national currency, as well as disruption in supply chains in the economy and in increase of production cost for companies when they were able to operate in the country. Fiscal deficit was high last year, and it will be high this year as well, but this was caused by immediate and inevitable needs to finance medical expenditures, as well as providing social support to most affected population and companies, as well in terms of some tax evasions. There have been subsidies as well to assist some sectors to go through this period of time. I think this is a test for the economies. Economies which are able to deal with the hardship of the crisis with right macro policies and not with populistic policies.
What is the regulatory approach of NBG in these terms?
Regulatory approach of the NBG came quite quickly after the breakup of pandemic, and we announced a temporary plan for banking supervision, for supervision of companies and banks and microfinance institutions. And it entailed allowing these organizations using those buffers which have been accumulated before in terms of capital, in terms of liquidity. At the same time, we asked commercial banks to look at their assets and to see what will be the damage from this pandemic, because of course it would have been naive to think that there would not have been impact. Because there would have been companies and physical persons, and SMEC would not be able to repay their obligations. Commercial banks made provisions of about 3.5% of portfolio for loans which most likely would not be repaid to them. Of course, it lowered their profit, but at the same time, it enabled them to see the clear picture and to go on with financing and with providing financial resources to the economy. Of course, I have to mention that without those measures which we implemented before the crisis, like improving quality of the capital, improving liquidity of the financial system, introducing responsible finance lending principles, the banking sector would not be able to meet this challenge prepared. But this preparedness is helping us to maintain financial stability. So this is one part. The second part, which we also did right after breakup of pandemic, was to make sure that we provide enough liquidity to the system, because in this case, as one of my former colleagues of Bank of Israel, Jacob Frankel, would say, in this period what is important is liquidity, liquidity, and liquidity is absolutely crucial, because in the situation when repayments to financial institutions went down because they provided some deferrals, moratorium on payments. There was a first stage, second stage, now it's a third stage. It was necessary to make sure that there was enough liquidity. We introduced swaps with commercial banks. We allowed microfinance institutions to receive liquidity through commercial banks. We also signed swap agreement with European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, based on which organization was able to provide liquidity to its clients. We also introduced a new mechanism for this period of time, which enabled commercial banks to provide more resources and liquidity to small and medium enterprises, because we took these loans as a collateral. We added it to collateral base of the central bank. At the same time, we introduced a temporary liquidity mechanism, which, by the way, was not used. Banks, actually, for them it was important that mechanism exists. That is why it gave them a comfort. And also, we had, for the first time in our history, we had a repo agreement with European Central Bank, which also, in case we need, will allow us to receive liquidity from European Central Bank.
Since this interview with Fitch Ratings was also in the checkpoints, and they called your approach to the banking sector for them to evaluate the damage and then make reserves, Fitch called it quite unique, comparing it to the policies that other central banks used. So what is your take on that? What was so unique about Georgia's situation that you decided to go the way you went?
I think that the reason is twofold. One is that we have quite a good cooperation and data exchange with financial system. We make sure that commercial banks themselves, they have, and not only commercial banks, but microfinance institutions as well, they have solid information about their clients, and they analyze this data. Because if you don't have this data, it will be difficult to assess what will be the consequences of economic downturns. This is one. And the second is that we knew that we had a good buffers. We had a good buffers in terms of capital, quality of capital, and liquidity. And we knew that sort of reasonable amount of expected losses our system would be able to absorb these losses. And if you have this sort of healthy situation, it is better to acknowledge it once in the beginning, because it allows you to see the real balance sheet of consolidated balance sheet of the financial system. And in this case, I mean commercial banks, mostly because they are the biggest part of our financial system. And but when I have mentioned it with my colleagues, because there have been a lot of forums and discussions about it, this sounded very, very attractive. But some of my colleagues also have mentioned that they, in private discussions, that most likely they would not have been able to do this. From my experience as an economist, is that there have been central banks which allowed commercial banks to continue operations as if nothing has happened, and to have sort of good and nice balance sheets. But of course, these bad assets did not go anywhere. They were still there. And when a real recovery had to start, and when investors find out about this, of course, they were not willing to remain in the country. So in some cases, they left the country. In some cases, new investors did not come. So this hardship came in anyway. Non-performing loans increased anyway. So this uniqueness was to acknowledge what is the situation, to assess, first of all, reflect it, and to see how far the system can go.
Another difference, if we look at more globally, is how you are dealing with the monetary policy. Because we see that the big part of the world has chosen to ease the monetary policy, so to help the economy. But here in Georgia, we are still with a tighter approach. Why, and what is the reason behind this approach?
Well, first reason is that we had different starting positions from other countries. You remember that in 2019, Georgia also experienced an external shock. Because of ban of flights from Russian Federation, which through expectations, negative expectations, spilled over depreciation of exchange rate, and then to inflation. And then we took appropriate steps, and when the problems started to be resolved, and when we saw exchange rate stabilized and actually coming back towards the direction of the previous level, and inflation started to go down in line with our expectations, then the pandemic happened. So the starting position for Georgia was different. And another difference for Georgia, the two differences I have to say, is the dependency of the Georgian economy on tourism, because tourism was a sector which was first of all which pandemic impacted, because it was a mobility, right? Because it does not allow mobility. So once mobility was affected, so came almost zero level of tourists in the country. And the second was the high dollarization of the still high dollarization of Georgian economy, because once the system is dollarized and there is a pressure on exchange rate which comes from deterioration of current account balance, which happened in Georgia last year, then their expenses are increasing in already difficult situation because of lockdown, because of difficulty in conducting the businesses. Georgia was the first country who received assistance within IMF supported program country. Who received the assistance together with other donors, and I think that the fact that there were fiscal buffers accumulated, there were capital and liquidity buffers in the financial system, it allowed us to deal with it. Of course, I mean, when I'm talking about this, it looks like that, you know, everything is fine and everything is nice, and of course that's not the case, because impact still happened, right? There was most likely like -6% reduction of real economy.
2021 now, and that will be my question. Do you think it brings more certainty to some level?
More certainty than we had last year when the pandemic broke up, but at the same time, this more certainty is not always very good news. And let me explain what I mean. For example, in terms of recovery in tourism, everybody, and I mean here also economic profile international institutions, they thought that tourism would recover quite quickly, especially if the vaccine is on table, but it did not happen like that. For example, last week there was also information by the World Bank that most likely tourism is not going to recover until 2022. But at the same time, still we see more certainty. Still, because of surprises from pandemic, it is not 100%, but we can see the main direction of challenges which might be brought again by pandemic.
What is the nature of these challenges?
For example, if there is still difficulties, there's a new stem of virus, what will be the main impact, and through which it will be felt. The same fact which I mentioned is that tourism most likely will not recover in this year as we had expected before.
So you think that driving economy further is totally up to the external factors that are affecting economy today?
It's
Am
not
I right?
totally up to those factors, but those factors will be shaping recovery of the economy.
Thank you so much.
We are BMG. Follow and subscribe for business and economics news.